Hello. Welcome. Thank you for attending. I'm Allison Jones Turner with Source Booksellers here in Detroit, Michigan. We are so excited to host this event for Lonely Stories. I hope that you got a chance, if not, to read a little bit about the book in our Eventbrite, but we're going to talk a lot about it today. But first, I'm just going to introduce who is going to be talking about the book today. But before I begin that, we're going to be sure to I want to help everybody to navigate this Zoom. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask, you're going to put it in the Q&A. We will try to catch it in the chat if you're unfamiliar with the Q&A, but that's probably the best place to make sure that your question gets some attention when it's time. If you need closed caption, the closed caption is at the bottom of the screen as well. And so those are the two things that I just wanted to remind you of. So let's get to it. Let's get to the people. Natalie Eve Garrett is an artist and a writer. She's an editor of Eat Joy, Stories and Comfort Food from 31 celebrated writers. The Artists and Writers Cookbook, a collection of stories with recipes. A graduate of Yale University and the Pennsylvania School of Design. Garrett lives with her family outside of DC. She'll be in conversation with two of the writers that contributed to Lonely Stories. Melissa Phoebos is an author of the memoir Whip Smart. She is the inaugural winner of the Jean Cordova Nonfiction Award from Le Monde Literary and the recipient of fellowships from McDowell, Colony, Bread Loaf, which I'm interested to know more about, and others. Her essays have appeared in the Paris Review, Tin House, the New York Times even. She's an associate professor at the University of Iowa, where she teaches nonfiction writing. And so just a little, our tagline at our bookstore is a nonfiction niche. So hearts and hearts, okay? And lastly, but not least, Megan Giddings. Her first novel, Lakewood, was a nominee for two NAACP Image Awards and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for the, get this, Ray Bradbury speculative science fiction and fantasy category. A Michigan notable book. And we are excited for her new book, which is coming out later this summer, called The Women Could Fly. Okay. She's an assistant professor at Michigan State University and affiliate faculty at the Antioch University. It's a low residency MFA. And both of them are going to talk a little bit about Mid-Michigan and a midpoint. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well,
I forgot to ask my question to Natalie. My question, I was so excited to hear about the book, right? So my question is, we at the bookstore here sold Eat Joy, that collection of the writers about comfort food. How is first collecting writers on these strong subjects of hardship and loneliness? First, how difficult is it? And do you have to do a lot of reading, or do you look into their work and say, these are perfect writers for this subject?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to who I've invited, it's always been sort of a a personal kind of path. I mean, I think I've tried to invite people whose work I felt some kind of kinship with, or, you know, whose words have kind of sparked out at me. So, I mean, it's just kind of I didn't necessarily, there's some people who I've written who I asked for whom, you know, they're essay writers. And then there are other people who I invited who really, I had not read essays from them, but I admired them. And I thought that maybe they'd have something to say, or I hoped they might. So.
Well, great job. Excellent.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Source for hosting us. And thank you, of course, to Melissa and Megan for joining. For anyone else who's watching, I am just as starry-eyed as you are to be with the two of them. But we were just talking about how I feel like there's such poetry in doing virtual events for a book like The Lonely Stories, in which, you know, we're each alone, but also kind of connecting via our aloneness. So I think it's really lovely. So thank you all for joining. So The Lonely Stories began with a question inspired by Ross Gay's The Book of Delights. And he writes, what if we joined our sorrows? And what if that is joy? And when I was working on The Lonely Stories, I kind of rephrased that in my mind as what if we joined our loneliness? And what if that is joy? When I was a child, I spent a lot of time alone. I was kind of like the sick kid in my school. I often had sinus infections. I had like this big medical file. My mom shuttled me off to so many doctors. I do not have the best immune system. I've really been quarantined for the past 2 years. Like, think of like your dearest elderly friend, and that's been me. But I had undiagnosed migraines and chronic fatigue before that had a name, and anxiety. So consequently, I really empathize with the loneliness of isolation. But at the same time, all that alone time for me was kind of a wellspring of creativity. And now, as an adult and as an artist, a painter, and a writer, I really find that I relish and crave and often, seek out that solitude and alone time. So I really love the idea of conjuring a book that would help tease out the ways in which alone time can be both totally maddening and also even joyful. I think, for me, kind of acknowledging our vulnerabilities, including anxieties about loneliness or about being alone, can be kind of a stepping stone to joy, in that, it's a stepping stone to the joy that comes from feeling relieved and feeling catharsis. Like, I'm not the only one. I'm not the only one who feels this way. So, the book The Lonely Stories is 22 personal essays from celebrated writers and illuminating the experience of being alone. I embarked on it before the pandemic, but much of it was written during the pandemic, specifically, I think, during 2020. And much of it explores, most of it actually is not specifically about the pandemic, but explores, types of aloneness that existed long before and will continue to exist, long after the pandemic's aftermath. But for me, in the wake of living through this kind of collective isolation that we've all been through, I think, the premise resonates even more strongly. And I hope it does for the reader too. And I hope, the reader might find these stories as kind of transporting and really kind of unlonely, as I do. And with that, I would love it if each of you might be willing to read a bit from your essays. I don't know if one of you wants to, maybe Megan, do you want to go first, since your essay opens the book?
Yeah, I'll go first, and also that way I can pay attention to Melissa so I don't get scared the whole time, if that's cool. So here's the book. And I'm just going to read briefly from my essay. I'm going to read the middle section. And this middle section is called The Only Person in the Movie Theater. Sometimes women younger than me ask me for advice. I think it's partly because I'm tall and an occasional professor, but mostly it's because I have the stink of older sister all over me. There are people who can smell the spiciness of judgment, the green scent of empathy, the bombinil notes of tell me what you really want seeping out my skin. Before 2020, I would tell younger women, especially those who wanted to be writers, to go to the movies alone. The friend I was supposed to go with bailed because the drag king she was flirting with had finally responded to her text. The house I was living in was old and overfilled with people, and we were all broke and fighting about when we could turn on the air conditioner. So I bought myself a salad, slid it into my tote bag, and went to the worst theater downtown. Its chairs were tortuously uncomfortable. Despite being on the second story of a building, the theater's lobby carpet smelled like cigarettes, butter, and basements. Inside, the air was too cold. The movie was bad but had terrific clothes, and somehow I was alone on a Wednesday night. I sat in the back and tried not to chew my lettuce too loudly. During the credits, I turned instinctively to the empty seat next to me. I was embarrassed when I realized it was the first movie I had ever seen alone. There are so many good reasons for women to not want to be alone in public. Even during the day in that fairly safe college town, there were always people shouting racist things at me out of car windows, men trying to talk at me, people assuming that because I was in public, I was open to and ready for an uncomfortable conversation. All the men I was friends with at the time rarely went to the movies alone. They'd tell me about the blockbusters, the art houses, the classic movies that they had seen. Out with my boyfriend or other friends, I would see them, men walking around alone at night, smoking cigarettes, oblivious to everything but nicotine, wind, and the shape of the smoke drifting out of their large mouths. I wanted that freedom. It feels almost cliche now to write about Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own when considering necessary loneliness and creativity. But I've always admired when other writers are frank about how money is truly a necessary factor when it comes to having the space to make things. I tell women to go to the movies alone because there's something I think contemporary women need at the beginning of their lives, maybe almost as much as money. That feeling of freedom, where you don't have to consider other people or their needs or the ability to cultivate a barometer of self-reliance that can come from even something as small as going to a theater by yourself, seeing something and not feeling the urge to tilt your head and gauge the amount of fun other people are having. So often, women are conditioned to be people pleasers, to be the ones who keep things smooth and pleasant for everyone around them. I tell women to do these things for themselves because worrying too much about other people can smother the risk-taking part of your brain that writing needs. It's a small thing. In the dark theater, I learned that I didn't need to look at someone else's face lit by a screen to understand how to feel. My emotions are valid. Sometimes I can simply look into myself to know the world around me. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Megan. I loved that. Not only because I also stink of older sister and gravitate to people and works by older sisters. Okay, I'm going to read just from the beginning of mine. I like that we bookend the book. Yours is the first and mine is the last. And this, my essay is called Notes from the Midpoint of a Celibate Year. And I might be a little awkward because I'm going to try to skip over some stuff that's not really relevant, but bear with me. There's this woman on my flight to London. I see her 4 rows behind me, tousled hair in a wool beanie, leather boots belonging to the category worn only by lesbians and Dickensian orphans, giant backpack, and my seduction sonar locks onto her. Like an insect whose physiology makes its carapace glow during mating season, or the calorie pear trees that emit their volatile amine to attract pollinating insects, thus perfuming my whole Brooklyn street with the ammoniac scent so reminiscent of semen. I feel myself begin to glow with some chemistry visible only to the object of my attention. I don't understand the biological protocol that enacts once it is triggered, but I do know that more often than not, if I want it to be, the end result is sex. And given my history, probably some sort of romantic entanglement. I cannot say why 6 months into my avowed celibacy, I have yielded to the familiar siren song of a cute dyke. I have disengaged myself so many times now from equally compelling opportunities. That editor at the fancy book party, the trans film director, all those loose ends and rain checks with whom I'd cut off contact months ago. But here I am turning my profile to the angle mathematically most likely for her to see me, rolling my shirt cuffs up to bare a few inches of forearm tattoos, dangling my hand with its short, unvarnished nails into the aisle. Like most femmes, I'm an expert at signaling my queerness through physical clues legible only to other queers. I can communicate my sexual identity through the set of my shoulders if need be. This is all behavior I've largely abstained from over the last 6 months, but I reason that there's little danger of a full relapse, given that we are on a flight to London and unlikely to come any closer to each other than the 4 rows of seats now between us. After we land at London Gatwick, the attractive stranger gathers her belongings, runs a hand through her messy hair, and yes, glances in my direction before she rises to her feet and steps into the aisle. These past 6 months, to my great surprise, have been the happiest of my life. It wasn't happiness exactly that I sought when I decided to spend 3 months celibate. I was so tired and I wanted to make better choices. I met my first girlfriend when I was 15 years old and spent the next 20 years in relationships. I was mostly a serial monogamist, though the ends of many of my affairs overlapped slightly with the beginnings of the ones that followed, forming a kind of daisy chain of romances. There were a few periods of singleness, but I was never alone, really. There was always a cohort of flirtations, a string of dates, a lover from my past, eager to step into the present. And after a few weeks or months, I'd find my next soulmate. Once I reached my 30s, I started having moments of unease when I contemplated this pattern. I was just a relationship person, I told myself. I took comfort in the fact that I had spent my happiest times partnered without noting the givenness of that since I'd spent most of my life partnered. I was reassured by the fact that I never felt afraid to be alone. I never considered how one might not ever feel the thing she had successfully outrun. Then at 32, I started a long distance relationship with a powerfully charismatic woman. For a month or two, it was a surreal exercise in wish fulfillment, as if I were living in a pop song or a poem. What followed were the most harrowing 2 years of my life. I had been addicted to heroin and had gotten clean in my 20s, but quitting this woman was even harder. On the other side of that experience, as I began to repair my life and all my other relationships, I understood that it was time for a reckoning within myself, and I needed space to do that. The first few weeks of celibacy were challenging as I pruned all the romantic prospects from my life and learned to let opportunities pass. But after that, something incredible happened. My life opened up, like a mansion whose rooms had been locked. There was so much more space in which to live. From the long, wordless mornings and days spent at my desk to quiet evenings reading in bed, I luxuriated in the solitude. It was sometimes lonely, but that too was novel, like a weather system that moved through me. And after a day, or sometimes just an hour in the late afternoon, as the light changed toward evening, it moved on. At the end of the 3 months, I decided on 3 more. At the end of 6 months, 3 more. And I'll stop there.
Wow. Thank you both so much. That was amazing. It was really like, I loved hearing your 2 pieces back to back, because like you said, they do bookend the book. And in my mind, there's always been kind of a kinship somehow between, when I found out I was doing, only virtual events, I really hoped that I could have the 2 of you together, because I don't know, I guess there's this sort of a special thing about like the first essay and the last essay. And in my mind, they have to kind of like I sort of had a arc in mind for the book, even, it's its own thing to kind of pick which ones, kind of nestle up against each other within the book, and each one has its own arc within it, of course, but I had in mind, as I was like putting it together, this feeling of kind of a journey and then homecoming, and each of yours actually has that arc sort of within the piece, and then hearing them together, I don't know, there's just kind of a rhythm. I feel like maybe I'm just imagining this, but I've like really, I was excited to have the 2 of you together, and yeah, it was really wonderful to hear them back to back. But I'm curious to hear maybe like sort of what your reaction was when I first sent you the invitation, because I think I probably reached out to you both sometime in 2020, although I feel like my memory is so hazy. Like the pandemic has just warped my memory. Like I'm like, was it before? I don't even know, but I think it was during the pandemic. I'm not certain. And I don't know. I'm curious, like if you knew what you wanted to write about immediately, or if, the topic gave you pause, or, if you had explored loneliness or aloneness before. I don't know. What do you have thoughts?
I'm happy to respond to that. I also have questions for you, just to stick a pin in that. But I guess I felt excited when you wrote to me, because I'm actually I'm in like the very early stages of writing a book about celibacy, and which sort of uses my experience as a like kind of light narrative structure, but like delves into sort of celibate women and celibacy as like a path, sometimes the only path towards like sovereignty for women particularly. And in many ways it's a book about aloneness, in both sort of the women that I'm reading about throughout history and like globally, but also in really sort of reflecting on why it was so important for me to be alone. And I think that loneliness is a big part of that as well. And some of my favorite writing has been sort of people writing about loneliness and solitude, and sort of the how important they are to the artist's process and mindset, and how sort of making friends with loneliness and solitude are so necessary to sort of the thing that we do. And so and I think like the easier and maybe most truthful answer is that like a constraint and being sort of pushed into something. And I was like, okay, I'm going to think of something very that I haven't written about yet, that is like very specific, and sort of, so it will be, I wrote an original essay for this that will probably end up somewhere in the book. But so I wrote about this like almost little relapse experience that I had while traveling abroad. I think partly because some of the most piercing kinds of loneliness I felt have been while traveling alone. And those were also some of the most like transcendent, meaningful forms of travel I've done, is like when I go to other countries by myself and sort of have to provide my own company in that way. So that felt rambling, but thank you for the question.
No, not at all.
I think I was really scared when you asked me, actually, Natalie. Like I was in the middle of teaching. It was my first ever CNF class, and I was doing all the writing exercises with my students. And I don't think any of them were the same, but we were all clearly writing like depressed person's work all together. And I mean, I was less like forthright than they were about it because I was the professor, but it was still like, I wasn't exactly sure how to write an essay for you, because you'd mentioned joy of solitude. I remember just coming back to that over and over when I was thinking about doing it, because like so many of the essays I was writing were like, I stayed up all night watching movies because I was so like pandemic brained, and it was the only way to just not, I don't know, smoke weed or do something else, just watch movies and try to get through when I couldn't sleep or was too anxious. So it turned into something much better when I started to think about, well, how can I find the experiences for joy? I know at one point I was trying to think of things that were like actually joyful during the pandemic, but I had nothing. So everything was before. Yeah,
I remember when I wrote you, actually, and I had a joy deficit in the book, and I knew it, and I knew that I had wanted that all along, but I hadn't, there came a point where I had to try and push for it, because I mean, part of me was like, is it just that I need joy? I'm asking people for what I need in my life, like, but no, the book really did need it. And yeah, I mean, your essay is so powerful, and it's, I'm very grateful that you wrote it.
We could inject a little bit in there. I also love, Megan, how yours is like list essay, and it feels almost like a I mean, it definitely has its own sort of narrative arc, but it almost also makes me think of kind of a panel of comics or paintings, you know, where we get to sort of
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it does have the different scenes. There are a lot of pieces in the book, I feel like it's really like a transporting experience, and yours has like the different landscapes even within it, which I really love, especially like as a painter, like a visually attuned person, like you really
Yeah, Natalie, almost every essay you chose, there's something like really painterly about it, either from like those like deep landscapes that are communicating something else, or like the way everyone's doing different structures.
Yeah, no, I feel that, and I don't know that I really had a hand in it. I think I don't know how did this happen. Is it just I'm really lucky, I think, but yeah, no, it feels like a painterly book somehow, which really it suits me. The sense of like space, I really love. I'm also curious, and I don't know if you'll have thoughts on this, but well, sort of two things, I guess. I'm curious if like in the process of writing your essay, if your relationship to solitude or loneliness changed, or if not, then maybe like, if it changed during the pandemic, if it changed the way you think about solitude and loneliness. The essay, the pandemic, I don't know. Or I could answer it first if you don't have an answer, if you want to.
Those are two big questions.
They are two big questions. Yeah.
I mean, they're great. I mean, I can say sort of just to the first part of that writing the essay for the anthology, I think the reason why I can't stop writing essays is because sometimes people are surprised to hear this, but like actually I'm not an instinctively reflective person, and I just sort of like keep it moving in my life. And so the event that I wrote about, like that particular little piece of experience, was not something I had ever thought about since it happened. But the psyche knows, right? Like I got this little email in my inbox about writing about loneliness, and I was like, all right, I'm gonna it's gonna be related to the celibate year at some point. And I just sort of like did a little scan of my memories, and this one was like, hi. I could use a little more thought over here. There's like something to be reflected on here. And I was like, oh, interesting. And so like I had never and it was embarrassing just to read part of like that process of sort of like trying to seduce a stranger. And have never reflected on the process of doing that. And I was like, oh my God. It was a humbling experience writing the essay. And also to arrive at like, oh, why, spoiler alert, like nothing happens. It seems like it's going to a number of times and nothing happens. And I was so relieved when it didn't. And there was just like a piece of it that I hadn't thought about, which is like, I don't know, what are the more minor compulsions that aren't like they don't ruin my life. They're just like, why is it harder to give myself permission to sort of walk towards something that might be painful, like being alone, but that also that's really great. I don't know. So it pushed me into that, which was really cool.
Yeah.
I don't know if it changed how I felt about loneliness. I feel like I've been a very lonely person my entire life in some ways. That sounds really sad, but it's not. I mean, some of it is kind of just like the self-imposed. Like I've never minded being alone. In fact, was kind of just anxious most of my life to be alone. Like I shared a room with my two sisters for most of my life. And we also like lived in like this really small, it's not that small, but still like this rural town. We were one of the only few families of color. So there would be all of these like experiences I had where like no one felt the same way as me. And it's kind of like now, whenever I go into Twitter, this is going to sound really winding and weird, but whenever someone does does anyone else feel this way? Like they seem shocked that they could have like a solitary opinion. And it's like, I'm sure there are plenty of people that feel the same way as you. It's more of you're trying to find this way to articulate how lonely you're feeling and whether or not it's a good loneliness or a bad loneliness. And I guess what I think I'm thinking a lot about is how this essay and also my next book, they're kind of trying to teach me a little bit about how complex the idea of loneliness actually is. Like how do you know when you need community, and how do you know when you genuinely need to be apart so that you can process and understand things? And I still don't have the answers for either of those questions. Maybe I'll never have them.
Yeah, I feel that. I feel that. I mean, I think I definitely was kind of a lonely kid, in part because I was like sick a lot. And so I was like, necessarily by myself a lot. But then like, I don't know. I mean, I was also like, had anxiety and was like an awkward kid. And I mean, I think there was a time that I was less self-conscious, and then I was really self-conscious, and like I switched schools and didn't know anyone and was like, in my own little hole. But that's when I found my way to painting, which was like the alone time that I chose. And so there's that difference, like previously, like, be like a Friday night and it'd be like, I wasn't invited to any of their cool parties, and that would be lonely. But then, it could be like a Friday night and I'd be getting rest because I was going to go out like painting the sunrise the next day in the woods by myself. And I chose that. And I guess that's the difference, like, when it's chosen versus when it chooses you, I guess.
I wonder if you go back, like, I mean, the list of people that you have published in this book is maybe a testament to that, but I feel like all of the artists I know have some relationship to like a deep kind of loneliness, whether it's like actual absence of people or like feeling singular in the self, like when I was a kid, I just like felt different in certain ways. Like my family was different in certain ways. And I would just like sit in my room and read until it felt like I was disembodied or like in an altered state. And that was kind of the goal, right? Where I would like be like, I don't even know what a human being is. I could never talk to one because I am just like a vapor that absorbs narrative. And like, that was not great for me, but and definitely worried my parents who were like pro reading, but it seemed kind of extreme. But like, would I have the life I have today, which I love, which is like built around stories? I don't know, or like have the capacity to sort of sit alone in a room doing this like very, very, very long, lonely process if I hadn't sort of logged all those hours. I don't know. Natalie, do you feel like your relationship to loneliness has changed from reading all of these stories and sitting with them for the amount of time I imagine you have?
Yeah. I mean, I hope I have more compassion for like all the different permutations of loneliness that exist. Some of which, I hadn't thought about as much before, or I hadn't like registered, I guess. Like I hadn't thought about the loneliness of like shame, but like, of course, that's such a lonely thing. And I don't know. I mean, I hadn't like pinned down all of these different kinds of loneliness. And I also really hadn't thought about how like longing for solitude is a kind of loneliness, which never exactly like, I mean, it makes sense like now that I say it, but like because when you're really longing for it, but you don't have it, then it just like reflects such a like disconnect, like it's like a loneliness from oneself, I guess. Like you're lonely for yourself, which like I feel that all the time lately. Like, I don't know, like I feel like I've actually been feeling that the past couple of weeks since the book came out. And I think I felt that a lot during the pandemic too, because I feel like, there was on the one hand, like the loneliness of being separated from people that I love, many of whom I'm still actually kind of separated from, honestly. And and for many people, there was that kind of isolation, loneliness of being apart. But then there was also this like dearth of solitude where, for, at least for me, I was home with, my husband's been working from home, and then I have 2 kids who are home, and they both needed a lot from me. And so, yeah, it's like sort of twin pandemics happening at the same time. But yeah, that's something I've been thinking about a lot it's partly from the pandemic, and then partly as a result of making the book, that like yearning for solitude, and I don't know, as a kind of loneliness.
Yeah, I love that. It took me a long time to get in touch with that feeling as an adult, like many years of sort of always surrounding myself with people. And like, I don't know, I think I always had that feeling. I just didn't know how to recognize it, and like maybe wasn't willing to listen to it in a way. And
Yeah.
It wasn't until the year that I wrote about in this book, where I spent sort of like a year alone and I lived alone, that I was like, oh, that's what I am wanting. That sort of like to be that little kid who can just go to her room and like disappear.
Yeah. It's easier to recognize it than to like do something about it. But
well, especially when you have kids, it's a challenge for folks.
It is a challenge. Yeah, I don't know. We were talking about, I'm curious, like we were already kind of talking about this, but the role of solitude and creativity, because obviously we all need that alone time to create, but I'm curious, like, is it ever lonely for you, or is it always enriching and replenishing to have that kind of solitude and, creative alone time? Because I don't know. I feel like, yeah, like in the book, Lev has, his piece, if you've read it, about like going off into the woods to write and just being like profoundly lonely and like desperate to escape himself. But then actually, I feel like a lot of women in the book are like, please let me be alone, which is so funny. Like, I noticed there was like this dichotomy, like the men are like, help. And the women are like, set me free. But yeah, I don't know. For me, like that creative alone time, like when it's working, like, for me, it's more painting, because I feel like I think of myself more as a painter. I still feel self-conscious, even like calling myself a writer or even an editor, even though this is my 3rd book. I feel like more at home with words. Although honestly, if I was like doing a Zoom call with painters right now, I'd be like, no, I'm a writer, I'm an editor. So maybe I just like, I don't know. But I don't know. For me, like when I'm painting and it's like, and it's working, then it's so unlonely. And it's like, but then, yeah, I feel like but when it's not, it can feel really, really lonely. But I'm curious to hear from you.
I almost every time I'm sitting down and working, it feels good, just because
Awesome.
It's like a promise. I know I can do the thing. I actually think the loneliest time for me creatively, in something I wasn't prepared for, is when after I finished a big project, and I know that like every time I'm like, I'm going to carry on to the next thing, but there's like this element of grieving that I have to go through, that I didn't anticipate that at all when I'd written my first one. And now I'm kind of just in the middle with my second one, where it's not mine anymore. And it was my companion. It was my friend. Like, even when I was like lonely writing it, it was still there with me, this whole world and all of these people that I somehow made. Now they're not mine. And I have to kind of force myself now before I go talk to people who have actually read it, so that I don't become like one of those like just kind of clumped up people who want to fight everybody who disagree with their book or don't like it. I have to mourn, but it's really hard to just sit kind of in the loneliness of both. Like, I did the thing that I wanted to accomplish, but also it's not mine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. There is like a particular kind of, this isn't really an answer to your question, Natalie, but like publishing is really lonely process. just like being perceived by people who don't really know you is like one of the loneliest things I've ever experienced.
Yeah, 1,000%.
Even
It is really heartening to hear you guys say this because
God,
I feel like I'm feeling
whether
this for the past couple weeks. So I feel less alone.
good.
No, it's
Like,
normal.
I feel so much less alone hearing this. So thank you. Like,
Sometimes reading a good review of your book can be like deeply lonely because like nobody, like what you're describing, Megan, where no one will ever know it the way that we do, you know? And so like on some level, whatever the like quality of the perception is, it always has levels of misunderstanding, and being misunderstood is incredibly lonely, you know? And also, yeah, it's just, there's not a lot of places to complain about it either. So you really gotta know who your friends are. So you can be like, and I will say I do get lonely in the process sometimes too. And I think, I don't know, maybe this is like a particular kind of processy loneliness related to nonfiction, but I feel like a lot of the time with nonfiction, because I was mostly a fiction reader growing up and I didn't get a PhD or go to journalism school, but I do like a lot of research and some investigative journalistic stuff in my work. And it's just me in there. I mean, I think we all have this, but like, it's just me in there. And if I start to get stuck in a fear of like, I'm not doing it right, it's like, I want someone to come in and check my work, tell me if I'm doing it right, you know? And you know, with my last book, I definitely stopped at a certain point and came out and was like, sweetie, I think I need to go back to school. And she was like, you have tenure. And I was like, hear me out, journalism school. You can do it in like 1 year or like maybe a PhD in gender studies. And I really mostly an expression of like feeling lonely that I'm the only one making the decisions in there. And sometimes I just have a crisis of confidence and I feel like I'm not qualified, you know? And luckily, I think I have enough reference at this point that I can like call a friend, or she can like be like, okay, but this happened before and you still were able to finish the book without making a career shift. So like, maybe if you just go back to your desk for a little while, it will be okay. But you know, the thing I've always sort of like felt sad that I do my work all alone. I mean, I'm completely obsessed with the fact that I do it alone, and I don't like the idea of people collaborating or like writing for theater where so many other people can mess it up. Like that is terrifying to me. I sort of like being the only one that can ruin it, but it's also really scary to be the only one in the room when I get insecure, like I'm having a bad day, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just so long too. It just takes so freaking long to write a book. I'm sure to edit a book, it's just like, it's longer than the human spirit is built for. So we need company in whatever way.
Yeah, that is the one thing about making a book like this for me, like the experience of making it. I mean, there were times that it was lonely, like, you know, especially in the very beginning when I was like, what if no one wants to do it? And I sold a book and like, it's just like, sorry, it didn't work out. It's just me. But then that kind of like, you know, propels you forward because I mean, you have to, that's how it is. But then, you know, I mean, like working on this during the pandemic, kind of like saved me in a way. I mean, really, like it made the pandemic so much less lonely, and it was still plenty lonely. Although also, you know, I mean, there were joys too. It was a lot, and is still a lot. Yeah, just being able to collaborate with so many amazing people and like sort of forge my own little kind of creative community for the span of shaping this book felt like this really, like, you know, magical kind of thing.
Yeah.
Especially with like the topic, and then especially to do it during a pandemic, which was unexpected. I mean, I did sell it in 2019 because it felt resonant to me then. And I mean, if the pandemic hadn't happened, it still would have felt resonant to me because I mean, this is something I started thinking about with my last book, which was about, the foods we eat to get through the dark times in our lives and just eat joy. But, and I was thinking about how, people wrote about all these dark times. And there's just so much, like, the hard times in our life. I mean, we experience them alone for the most part. And I just was thinking about all of that loneliness and, how much loneliness there is in those times of our lives, but then also like how much beauty can emerge from that, which was kind of like the experience of making the book in a way during a pandemic. Like, this kind of magic emerging from all of the darkness. I did want to ask a couple more questions. I don't know, though, maybe we need to go to the Q&A. Is it time? I think it's time. Let's see if I can figure this.
I don't see any questions.
No questions? Can I keep posing questions? Perfect. What should I go with? I have a few. I don't know if you'll want to talk about this, but I'm curious to hear a few things. Well, one is like, if you would be willing to share your favorite kind of coping mechanisms for loneliness. There's some things that come up in the book, like you talked about, going to the movies alone. I don't know if that was for loneliness per se or just.
Oh, that's church for me now.
Yeah.
Which has made the pandemic harder because I also lost church too.
Yeah.
Although most people lost church. I think loneliness a lot of the time, it's reading. It's going back to reading, and during the pandemic, I got really into YA novels because they were also like the only books I could read that didn't feel like work. I could just have joy reading them, even when I could guess like what was coming. It was still just so much fun to read.
Nice. I love that.
That's definitely true for me too. Although I do, experience of loneliness for me can sometimes, it's been a while, but it can sometimes feel almost viral. Like it will infect the things that I love doing and make them feel sorrowful, and there's something I think actually the going to the movies by yourself, which is also something I've always loved. And I think in it is sort of one of the things that does work for me when I feel lonely and that sorrowful, I can't find joy in anything way. And that is to sort of really objectify myself in my own mind and really sort of think about keeping my own company. And this is gonna sound corny, but I actually do this. When I feel sad, be just sort of ask myself inside myself, what do you need right now? What would feel comforting to you? Do you want me to take you to the movies? Do you want me to take you to dinner? Do you want to go get a treat? Do you and actually think of it as the way that I would just be super tender and loving to a friend of mine if she was really sad and feeling lonely, and to really sort of change my disposition to myself instead of sort of being at the center of the loneliness to sort of slightly to the left of the loneliness. Just being loving to myself. And I think it really can transform an activity where I would feel sorry for myself and be no, I'm going to treat you to a movie, or because I think I learned to do that through going to the movies by myself, where I was wait a minute, what if this was great? And then I was oh, it is great. Actually, going alone is amazing. Yeah.
Honestly, it's not corny at all. I think more people should treat themselves that way. If we could just get more people to treat themselves like they're their best friend and be like, you know, you seem like you're being awful to yourself right now. What if you went to the movies together? What if you made yourself something nice for a second and just be sweet to yourself? I think in general, maybe even the way we talk about loneliness would be different.
Yeah.
No, I often feel like I'm being like corny or like cheesy when I actually have something really heartfelt to say. And yeah, that really resonated with me, and actually like I feel like that will change me. Like I hope that will, because I was remembering that I think the last line in my intro was like, or close to the end, I said something about like handling our aloneness with tenderness. But like that's exactly what you do. Like I don't know that I aspire to living that, but it sounds like you actually do that with yourself. It's just so much. It's easier for me to. Well, it's often this way, you know, to say it to someone else and to do it. I mean,
that's how I learned
oneself.
How to do that, is like creating, like a therapist told me many years ago, like, well, why don't you, if you can't summon this kind of like tenderness for yourself, what if you just imagined your child self or a friend you love or like the people you sponsor in your 12-step program? Like, what would you say to someone you love, like unconditionally? And it's like, oh, that's easy. You know, I would just say like, you're wonderful. You should treat yourself. Like you should do what feels good because you deserve it. And it's like, oh, okay. And that, so I like have to do that little one step remove to be like, what would you tell them? And then I'm like, okay, hey, Melissa. Yeah.
I love that. All right. I see there's something waiting in the question. Curious about I'm reading a question. It says, I'm curious about the process of publishing a detail or part of a story that feels urgent or timely or important to share, but also quite raw or fresh, and perhaps in need of more time to personally process. Have you ever been in a similar experience, or might you have any insights on how you've navigated something similar?
I mean, I definitely have experience with this. You know, there are essays that I have spent like 10 years writing because I started on it and I was like, I don't have enough information to share this with anyone yet, you know? And I come back to it a few years later with like some new information. And I'm like, this still feels too raw, like in my feelings and also on the page. Like I have not arrived somewhere different than I started yet with it in myself or on the page. And I just like, I wait for that feeling. Like if my relationship to something I'm writing about hasn't changed, I'm probably not done yet. And if I don't feel like excited for other people to share it with other people, this is just for me, like it's probably not done. What do you think, Megan? Is that your experience too?
That's my experience too. I was also thinking of like the converse side where like you've written something that you didn't think would be very timely. And then suddenly it's become very, very timely in a way that also makes you uncomfortable because you don't want to seem like you're exploiting a certain situation, but the way everything like converges, it just happens that way. And I know that like a lot of the time they're like, well, writers are psychic, they're prescient when people do things like that. But it's kind of also feels gross when you're writing something and then people are like, were you writing about this immediately? It's like, no, this took me 10 years to get out. And it just happened to be in the middle of a pandemic or in the middle of another crisis.
Yeah. Definitely have that experience too. And yeah, it's one of those things. It's one of those things that makes publishing lonely because there's just no way that you don't get projected on like crazy. And it's like the place I've arrived at this point, like just after, you know, like 2 months after publishing my 4th book, is like with increasing conviction is like, it's none of my business. You know, like my business was the 7 years I spent alone in the room. Like that's my business. What happens afterwards, and even the questions they ask, like, yeah.
So you can distance yourself from all of it. You can.
I mean, to an extent, I try. I mean, I feel like there's like concrete things I can do, but before I published my third book, I did go to my therapist and I was like, I need to do some work. I want to separate these things so that it feels, so that I can have more distance. And yeah, and I basically just like made lots of lists of like, this is what publishing is, and this is what writing is. And it turns out there's like very little overlap. Those lists of like completely different things, even though it gets like opaque sometimes, you know, so. Yeah.
Interesting. I'm taking notes here. But, oh my gosh. Oh wait, no, there are no more questions. Let's see, I think I can ask you a couple more. I'm curious to hear what surprises you the most about loneliness, or what surprises you the most about solitude, if things come to mind. For me, I'm still just thinking about longing for solitude, but maybe that's just like, you know, my life these days, but longing for solitude as a kind of loneliness. But
I think that's like, that feels like the freshest because of the pandemic is like really refined my understanding of also like how you can crave loneliness and also crave people at the same time. Like,
yeah.
It was so messed up. I mean, it's still, you know,
Yeah, it still is.
I moved to the Midwest from New York in the pandemic. Yeah. And so like, I just like also couldn't make friends. Like I'm just making friends.
Oh, that's the Midwest. Don't worry. That's not you.
So it's, but then also it's like, I haven't been to like a residency or like, I don't know. You can be like everything at once. You know, many like contradictory kinds of lonely at the same time, you know.
Yeah, I feel that.
I think the Midwest is just a lonely place too, where
because you're in Michigan?
I'm in actually Indiana at the moment, but I was teaching in Michigan. Yeah. And now I'm moving to Minnesota, and everyone was being like so sweet and welcoming. Like truly, like I'm really excited to start the job. But the thing that I keep laughing about is they kept warning me, like, but when you get here, you're gonna realize that people are kind but not friendly. Like they were talking about just people who live in Minnesota, and I was like, that's Michigan too. I mean, you can name off almost every Midwestern state, and you'll get people who will like pull your car out of a ditch in a snowstorm, don't know your name. And also when you try to talk to them about just like a casual thing, are the biggest assholes you'll ever meet about like just having a conversation. Like, how dare you try to be friendly and chit chat with me?
Interesting. Yeah. It's been slow. Work here. You know, starting over socially as an adult just is lonely anyway, because everybody's life is already too much for them to handle. So you have to make kind of a strong case for yourself.
That's true. Oh, that's so true.
But it's places are different. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, the Midwest is very different from anywhere I've ever lived. So. Hi, Allison.
Hi, yay for the Midwest.
Yay for the Midwest. I do like it here.
I do too. I can't leave.
Yeah.
I also admit that Detroit is nicer than most places in the Midwest too.
Yeah, Detroit is a little different from where we're.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Melissa. Did you have another burning question, Natalie?
I think I'm good. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Well, I just want to remind everybody that Lonely Stories is available. It's available at Source Booksellers online and in store. It's also available at any independent bookstore that may carry it. And so we're celebrating it today, but we want you to keep reading it and rereading it and experience the authors in the essays and also in their books. So thank you so much. Source Booksellers is very excited to celebrate this book, and thank you for everyone that's hanging in with us and experiencing the conversation. And any last words for anybody?
I just want to thank you for hosting us, and thank you, Natalie, for including us in the anthology. It's really great.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you. And thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah. All right. Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.